Ms. McLellan, if I may start with you, the task force recommended that edibles and concentrates be legalized and regulated. Can you please tell the committee why the task force made that recommendation?
Because they are products that are readily available. When we discussed legalization in states like Colorado and Washington, and as someone earlier mentioned, it's a growth area in the cannabis marketplace. And obviously, if you're concerned about public health, you want to move people away from smoking product into enjoying their cannabis, or if it's for medicinal purposes, their therapies in non-smoking forms. The edible market is one, as we've mentioned, and we mentioned in the task force report, is growing. It is varied. And also, we know there's a demand. And if you want to move from the illicit market into a regulated legal market, then you have to offer the quality and choice that the illicit market can provide. And we heard that, I think it's fair to say, Mark, over and over again from a wide variety of people we talked to, that there are public health reasons and public safety reasons why you would want to authorize or allow edibles in various forms, and the forms in which they come are only limited by one's imagination, we have discovered. Now, I do think it's fair to say that we heard a note of caution. Coming out of Colorado and Washington, what was their single biggest surprise out of the box? It was how much demand there was for edibles. So one of the things they told us was, you've got to be ready for that. You need edibles in your regulated market, but make sure you're ready. Make sure that you don't make the same mistakes we did, which was have somebody eat a whole chocolate bar. Because when you're eating an edible, it takes longer if you're looking for the high. So 30 minutes in, some guy has, I'm not looking at you, Michael. Some guy has consumed 2 squares of chocolate and is saying, oh, I don't feel anything, eats the whole bar. So Colorado had to go back in and fix all that, and their private sector weren't very happy about the additional cost. So you do want to be cautious. You want to make sure that you get the edibles piece right, because it is possible to make those kinds of bad judgments or mistakes. In terms of consumption, you need to make sure your labeling is accurate, that your warning labels are there, and all of that. So I would say you need to be cautious around edibles out of the box, learn from what we've seen in other jurisdictions, but absolutely they have to be part of the consumer choice going forward in a regulated market.
Right. And I think, as you pointed out, I think it's been mentioned time and time again that one of the prime focuses of this bill is to take production of cannabis away from the illicit market, the black market, the organized, criminally controlled market, and move it into the regulated world. And clearly the government hasn't taken that advice at this point. I want to point to what the task force said about Alaska. Quoting from your report, it says, the government may want to consider the approach taken by the Alaskan government, which prohibits the manufacture and sale of any cannabis product that closely resembles a familiar food or drink item, including candy, or is adulterated with additives or sweeteners. We are confident that with clear guidance to industry by the regulator and vigilant and predictable enforcement, this is not an insurmountable barrier, end quote. So it's taken 2 years for this legislation to come before Parliament. We have the example of the Alaskan government. There are other jurisdictions who have proceeded with edibles. Are you concerned that by passing C-45 without having a regulated environment for edibles, that we will continue to leave a large and, as you say, growing segment of cannabis to the black market, unregulated from a health point of view or a legal point of view?
I think you've answered your own question.
Thank you.
Right?
Thank you.
So, Mark, I don't know. Did you want to say something?
That's okay. I'm moved to Mr. Spratt. I take it that your answer was in agreement with me. Mr. Spratt, picking up again from the task force, another recommendation was that they recommended that offences with respect to exceeding the possession limit should be dealt with through graduated administrative penalties, tickets, seizures, and fines, except where there's evidence of intent to traffic. I want to focus on the graduated administrative penalties. there's a 14-year maximum that's conceivably applied to a 19-year-old selling marijuana to a 17-year-old. Now, I understand that courts will use discretion, but it's theoretically possible. That's far in excess of what would happen from a 19-year-old giving a cigarette to a 17-year-old or a 19-year-old bootlegging alcohol to a 17-year-old. In fact, the 14-year maximum is equivalent to leaving Canada for the purposes of committing terrorism or producing child pornography. Is that an example of a proportional offense? Do you think that that's justified under this legislation?
No, it's not. And you're quite right that in the circumstances that you've outlined, I would be shocked if a court ever imposed a 14-year sentence. But what we know from history, what we know from studies of the impacts of criminal records, it's the imposition of a criminal record, not the imposition of custody, that presents the biggest obstacle for young individuals to advance and become productive and pro-social members of society. So by leaving the option to impose a record at all in those situations, considerable harm will be done. And what we also know is that it's not a white kid from a Tony neighborhood who's going to get in trouble for passing a joint to a 17-year-old friend when they're 18. These will be already individuals who are marginalized, disadvantaged, and discriminated against. Those are who will end up in court facing charges like that. And there's nothing in this legislation, apart from a faith on discretion for ticketable offenses, that mitigates that problem.
Do you see any issue? The government has clearly said that it does not want to decriminalize now. The NDP has been pushing the government to do so. Do you see a mechanism for doing that? What would be the appropriate policy in terms of applying the criminal law right now, given that we're moving towards legalization?
It would be appropriate now, and it would have been fair and just long ago to craft a federal policy to urge prosecutors to use discretion in diverting these sorts of charges from the criminal justice system. It is an offense to possess marijuana now, but we know that that will likely soon change. It is an often and common misconception that right now people aren't arrested for marijuana offenses, and that's not true. People are. They're brought to jail. Mostly and largely, those people already suffer disadvantages or are from racialized minorities. They end up in our courts, and people do indeed get criminal records and receive criminal sanctions for simple possession of marijuana. It happened 2 weeks ago in an Ottawa court, where court time was spent dealing with a young man who possessed half a gram of marijuana. And in the age of judicious use of court resources and Jordan principles, with charges being thrown out of court, that is something that should not be tolerated, and something that can be easily fixed through a directive to public prosecutors.